Hello, everybody. Welcome back. So today we're going to be kind of continuing our discussion of fairy tales because that means we get it to move into the work of Vladimir Propp. So Propp's functions are relevant for fairy tales especially, but maybe we'll also see that they might be relevant to mythology too. So I think it's going to be pretty interesting looking at those. So what I want to start off with is looking at what you guys did for your list of things that can happen in a fairy tale. So let's go and switch over to looking at that. So what I did here is I basically collected all the different things here that you guys came up with so far. And granted, you know, I'm recording this a bit early, so I'm sure some more people will add some more onto the list. But we came up with a lot of cool stuff. The list, at least at a start, is 51 entries long, so that's pretty cool. You guys came up with a lot of cool stuff. So I think we all know, we all recognize that there's some common things that happen over and over again in fairy tales. And so to, you know, try and figure out a list of what those are is probably a pretty useful thing to do if you want to try and understand these. And so basically we are using this sort of list making to help us get a better insight into the way these fairy tales work, what they are, what they're trying to say. And you can do kind of similar things for mythology. And I think we'll see that that's pretty relevant to some of the myths that we've looked at. But you guys identified a lot of common themes. So there's a lot of stuff here. If we look at, maybe we can kind of combine it into categories here, or sort of group some things together. For instance, a lot of you guys talked about love, marriage, sometimes love at first sight. There was a lot of mention of princesses, royalty in general, but especially a princess having to be rescued. Happy endings are pretty common. We did talk about how the heroes usually get what they want and the villains usually get punished. There are some exceptions, but you could argue that those might be maybe more like folk tales than more of the standard form fairy tales. We've got characters like fairy godmothers, a lot of mention of animals, sometimes talking animals. I like that you guys put here talking and non-talking animals are both included. They have a magical power. There's a lot of things that we could call transformation, somebody getting turned into an animal, somebody getting transformed back, which is closely related to spells and curses. And there's a lot of talk about magical people or assistance from animals or creatures or beings. So maybe we can kind of combine those into the category of, you know, magical assistance from magical beings, these sort of helper figures. Royalty versus the common folk is kind of involved. Very often there's a quest. And every man encounters a magical creature or event. See, we're kind of riffing along the same lines. You know, we've got some of the same ideas going on here. A villain who breaks one of the values that the story illustrates. I like that a lot. And we talked a lot about there's very often a pretty clear a set of good things that are good to do and a set of things that are bad to do. You might almost call this a moral. It's almost even simpler than that. It's just, you know, the good people do good things and the bad people do bad things. A lot of you guys mentioned the rule of three, things that come in threes, things that happen 3 times, basically. That's pretty cool. And yeah, threes seem to be pretty easy for people to remember when they're telling stories. Happy endings, magical things happening. Maybe we can lump all the magic into one category. We've got magic, spells, curses, transformations. And in a way, there's kind of, you know, just like there's the heroes and the villains, there's magic that's used for a good purpose, and there's frequently magic that's used for a bad purpose. So you've got, on the one hand, your magical items that help people, you know, save the day, help some sort of protagonist save the day. And there usually is some kind of protagonist who's trying to save something or solve some problem. And then on the other hand, you've got your curses, your spells that need to be broken. Supernatural evil, you might say. And that kind of leads to a lesson to be learned. But that said, there's often failure along the way. It seems like the heroes often have to fail multiple times, and then they succeed on the 3rd time. Or, you know, you have 3 brothers, and the first 2 fail, and then the 3rd one is successful. Yeah, usually there's a problem that needs to be solved. I like this one here near the end, the idea of like 4 archetypes of main characters. You have a kind of hero, you have a kind of helper, you have the big bad, the villain perhaps we can call them, or the person who needs help, needs something done. I really like that way of thinking about it. And characters, of course, can play multiple roles. That's a really interesting way to think about it. if we look at all these, we can kind of notice that there's a lot that could be described as characters, and there's also a lot that could be described as events. So maybe those are our two big categories, characters and events. And maybe we can also talk about themes or values too. Like the ideas that are being put forth are not really characters or events, but are expressed with the characters and events. But if we just look at the most basic level, what are the different types of characters and events? Because you can have like very similar types of characters that express different values. Like one set of fairy tales might have this set of values, while another set of fairy tales might have this set of values. So if we were to look at this, we might try to make a list of all the characters and then make a list of all the things that they can do, all the actions that they can take along the way. So yeah, I think we're starting to see how these categories can be grouped together. And there's some common things that are like conventions that help you know it's a fairy tale, like the use of royalty and whatnot. These might be more closely connected to the themes. The idea of once upon a time, it doesn't always say once upon a time, but often they say something kind of along those lines, like once a long time ago at a certain time. So there's a distance between the modern day and the current world of the fairy tale. Yeah, we talk about substitute parents, stepmothers, evil parents. The knight in shining armor kind of corresponds to this hero character idea. Someone or something dies. Yeah, there's a lot of death, and I wonder what that's really about. Very often the protagonist, this hero figure, this knight in shining armor, is isolated in some way, or someone else is isolated in some way, like the princess who got turned into a raven, and now she's isolated from her family. So yeah, we're starting to churn up these themes here. So if we were to make a list, I feel like we have some categories here that we could very usefully put together into like some core concepts, basically. You know, I don't think it's bad that you guys have some repetition. I think there's definitely some overlap between different things here. Yeah, I think this is a really great list, and I'll be curious to see what else you guys come up with. But this is great for us thinking about, you know, what things come up over and over again and kind of casting our net very broadly. I like the idea of something needing to be done, and the idea of magic, the idea of the hero who does the things that need to be done, villains and helper type figures who are often magical or sometimes animals. These all seem to be really good directions to take this. Okay, so as you might have guessed, today we're going to be looking at the work of someone who did something very similar. And this is the work of Vladimir Propp. So let's switch over to the PowerPoint here. So who was Vlad? Who was Vladimir Propp? So Propp was a scholar of folklore. So he really studied folklore, folk tales, and the things that we might call fairy tales. Now, Russia has a very proud tradition of fairy tales. They call them wonder tales, or kazaka, or sorry, I'm not saying it right, but kazaka, it's something like that. And so, yeah, they don't use the word. So for them, fairies aren't the most important thing, but a sense of maybe magic or wonder is important. That's the wonder tales. So what Propp did is he made a giant pile of fairy tales. He just had a whole collection. And I forget what his methods are, if he read them from books or if he got them from people who were oral storytellers. But you can almost imagine that it was kind of similar to the Brothers Grimm in some ways. And so he took all these fairy tales and he looked at what are the common things between them that seem to happen over and over again. And he came up with basically his core list. He boiled it down to 31 things that can happen in fairy tales, and he called them functions. These might be called thought of as story events, but he called them functions because he thought they served a function for the story. And since mythology and fairy tales are both all about stories, you know, I think this idea of what is the function, what does this do for the story, is really useful for thinking about these things like fairy tales and myths. It helps us understand what they accomplish. How do they communicate these values? Because they're using these different tools that they have in their toolkit to say different things. Now he is kind of, it's a little more than 31 in a way, because he also has different characters that he's identified who are kind of the core characters of these myths. You guys identified 4. I think he'd add a few more on top of that. that kind of have very specialized uses. But so you've got some core characters and you've got some core kinds of events that can happen. And he thought once you had these events, you could pretty much boil it down to these, and you could take a look at a given fairy tale, see which events, which functions, and which characters it uses, and have a pretty good understanding of what that fairy tale is and what it's trying to do. Now, the important thing, this is very important, not every fairy tale has to have all 31 functions. It would kind of be a long, huge fairy tale if it did. Maybe there's some that would qualify. A lot of them have most of the functions or most of the characters. Some just have a few and just get by on a very basic set of functions. And often they repeat, this same function is used over and over and over again. But there is kind of a rough order to them. Some functions are very much associated with the beginning of the story. That makes sense, right? You've got beginnings. And then some functions are very much associated with the end of the story. So, this is the tropes around happy endings. And honestly, endings are all pretty similar according to Propp in most cases. So you've got these functions, and because they sort of have a rough order to them, he liked to assign them letters of the alphabet. So he, used letters of the alphabet, and then when he ran out of English letters, he also used Greek letters as well. And he used these all for the prologue of the story. This is the theory of how the method works. I have some quibbles with how he did things a little bit, but that's okay. So how did he go about this? Yes, so here's a real quick vocabulary lesson. He called this whole strategy of his a morphology. So sometimes you'll see it called Propp's morphology of fairy tales. And morphology just means study of the shape of something. So that's what Propp was really interested in terms of fairy tales. He wanted to study their shape, their sort of mechanical piece by piece attributes. As we said, a function is his term for one of these building blocks of the story. And he would start off with what he called the dramatis personae. And this just means people of the drama in Latin. And usually you'll see the words dramatis personae as a list of characters in a play, like who the actors are, who's playing them, and just as sort of the cast of characters would be a translation of it. So this is his list of his cast of characters. So for Propp, the first thing you did in order to really analyze the story was to come up with your cast of characters. But it's actually a multi-step process here, which we'll go through. The very, very first thing, right, has to be, number one, read the fairy tale, read the story. And the book suggests, and I think Propp suggested, that you first read the story without trying to do any of this analytical stuff. Just, get a sense of what it is and, what it's about and what it's trying to do just on your first read through. And then you can go through and do this analytical work. So that's step one, is to read the story. Step two is to come up with your dramatis personae. So we could use this method on any of our fairy tales and come up with a dramatis personae. So here's the full list of characters that Propp has in his cast of characters. We had talked about the hero. So the hero, usually the characteristics of the hero are that the hero is trying to solve a problem. Very frequently the hero is a male figure, but sometimes the hero can be female if the hero is kind of sort of written as, if a young woman is sort of written as a protagonist. Then you have the villain character. The villain often tries to harm the hero in some way, tries or succeeds, but usually fails in the end. And the villain is almost always punished for the evil things that they do. The villain always gets their comeuppance, for being evil. Then you have a character known as the dispatcher. The dispatcher doesn't do too much, but the dispatcher just sends the hero out on the journey, dispatches them to solve the problem. So the dispatcher, plays a very minor role and only at the beginning, but you do see some characters there like this. Their role is just to tell the hero to go on an adventure. Then you have characters who are known as donors. So donors give the hero a magical gift that helps them do a difficult task along the way in their journey. And the donor can also help solve the hero's problem using their magical artifacts or magical gifts. And sometimes it can be as simple as just like a piece of sage advice that helps them along their journey. Sometimes that can almost be treated like a magical artifact. But the donor is very similar to the helper. So the helper can do things like transport the hero from place to place, help them do their task without giving them any kind of magical thing, rescue them from the villain, help solve some of the problems for them. But the difference between the donor and helper is basically just that the donor is giving a magical gift or a tool of some sort, and the helper is someone who is just more sort of helping along the way. And there's some looseness in how you distinguish between these two categories here, because sometimes like how much is the donor like? Can someone who gives a piece of advice be considered a donor because they're giving the gift of advice? Sometimes. Can the helper be considered a donor in the case that they give the hero a gift of their help? So the line is kind of blurred, but I would say, if you feel like the character is more about giving a gift than just helping out, then we can say it's a donor. Now, donors and helpers, they both have in common that they will often test the hero in some way. And this could be something like, you have to get past my challenge or defeat me in order to get my gift or get my help. But this may not be necessarily like a planned thing. Like if we think back to the three thieves in the story of the Raven Girl, the hero guy comes and he beats them up and he takes their stuff. Well, they didn't intend to be donors, but they were donors effectively. He passed their test by beating them in a fight and taking their stuff. And meanwhile, with the giant that he met along the way, who was more of a helper figure, he defeated the giant by giving him food and passed the test of the giant by giving him food so that the giant wouldn't eat him. And then the giant helped him out by drawing him a map. Those are the kind of things that we can see here. Okay, now a very important character is the princess. I liked how you mentioned that we have that you could think of the category of like a person who needs the problem solved for them. And that's kind of like the princess. Like the princess needs to be rescued. Propp thought of it as a princess because so often these characters are just princesses needing to be rescued. And at the end of the story, the princess is usually married to the hero. But the princess presents the hero with problems to solve along the way. Now, this may not be the original problem the hero was trying to solve. The hero may switch from one problem to another, and maybe end up solving the original problem along the way, but also has to solve these tasks that someone like a princess sets before him. Now, I said you can sometimes have a heroine, a female hero, in which case you might have a princess be replaced by a prince. And so the reward is being married to the prince. I think we kind of see this in the story of the Goose Girl, that the prince is ultimately the reward and the reward for the princess at the end of the story. And I think a really great example is Cinderella, that Cinderella is basically our protagonist who's trying to solve the problems that she has. But the prince is ultimately the reward for her solving these problems. And she kind of has to solve the problem of not being recognized. But she does various different tasks along the way, like sorting through the ashes and things like that. But there's some room for interpretation here as to who you think is the protagonist and who you think is the princess being rescued. But when you rescue a princess, you're pretty much always going to end everything in the wedding, the marriage to the princess. So the princess is being treated as the reward. Now, sometimes the one who needs the problem solved is her father. And so both the father of a princess and the princess contest the hero because they think the hero is not worthy of marrying the princess. The princess is like, I will not marry anyone unless he like picks up all the stones on this beach. And then the hero finds a magical way to do this. And she's like, okay, I'll marry you. But the father might say something like that as well. There's a myth of Cupid and Psyche, where Venus, the mother of Cupid, makes this young woman Psyche do all these sorts of tasks, like get fleece from the fire-breathing sheep and things like that. So there's a gender-reversed one where it's the mother who is testing testing her so that she can marry this young god, and that feels very like a fairy tale. But yeah, it's all about these tests and tasks. So you can almost say like the most fundamental thing of a fairy tale is like just solving problems in various ways, usually through magical means. And then finally, you have the false hero. So the false hero claims to be the hero, but fails at the task that they're doing. Now, this could be explicitly like the hero's not recognized and there's this other person pretending to be them. Or it could be that the hero is like the third of three brothers, and the first two brothers try to do the thing and think that they're going to succeed. And that's what makes them false heroes. But then they finally succeed. Okay, so we've got the hero, the problem solver hero, we've got the harm-causing villain, we've got the dispatcher, we've got the donor who gives some sort of magical tool or useful thing, we've got the helper who does other useful things for the hero, we've got the princess and to some extent other guardian figures like her father who will test the hero but ultimately marry him as a reward at the end. And you've got the false hero who makes false claims about being a hero and fails. Okay, so that's step two is so if we were working with a fairy tale, we would go through it and say, who is our cast of characters here? One fairy tale of a sort that came up a lot in discussions in previous versions of this class was Shrek. I think Shrek actually fulfills a lot of the characteristics of this story. So, let's think about this. Who's our hero? Our hero would be Shrek. And what's Shrek's problem? Okay, well, we're going to get into that in a second. But the villain is Lord Farquaad, who is trying to harm Shrek in various ways. The dispatcher might also be Lord Farquaad. Some of these categories can overlap. I don't know if we have an explicit donor, but we definitely have a helper in the form of Donkey, who helps Shrek along the way and turns out to be an indispensable kind of figure who, seduces a dragon and is therefore responsible for transporting Shrek when he needs to travel really fast. So that's a very classic fairy tale type of thing. The princess is, of course, Princess Fiona, who kind of tests Shrek in various ways. And, the fact that she's just in a castle tests him. And then the false hero would also be Lord Farquaad. So he's doing triple duty here. He acts like he's a hero, like he's a knight in shining armor, but he falls flat when he tries to do this. And so you can see how these categories can combine. But I think we've got some great examples of some very classic fairy tale archetypes. Even though it's funny in Shrek, even though it's a parody, they all work really well towards these goals. Okay, so you've got your cast of characters. Step three is to identify a harm or a lack. And this is the first of Propp's functions. This is letter A. So a harm would be something that the villain does to harm the hero. Whereas a lack would be, the villain is not involved. The hero just has some sort of problem that he wants to solve. So I think you could interpret Shrek in various ways here. There's definitely a villain. So I think we can say that Lord Farquaad, the villain, harmed Shrek. And what's Shrek's problem? Well, he's got a lot of fairy tale creatures living in his swamp. What are you doing in my swamp? Can't do a Scottish accent. But that's his problem that he's trying to solve. And that's the harm that Lord Farquaad has caused for him. And so he's going on his quest primarily to solve that problem. So that would be, Propp would give that a capital letter A for harm. Now you could also maybe argue that Shrek has a lack instead. Because Shrek has a lack, which is, he's lonely, he doesn't have anybody to connect to, and people are scared of him. That could be described as a lack. So maybe that's what sets him off on his journey. But I think in this case, we would want to say it's the harm caused to him by the villain. But if we were going with a lack, that would be lowercase a to distinguish between these two options for basically the problem that the hero is trying to solve. Okay. Now we're going to get into alphabet soup here. But one of the things that Propp noticed is that there's very frequently a prologue type of part to the story. In fact, there's some very common themes that recur in all these prologues. So Propp, for some of his functions, he said these are specifically part of the prologue to the fairy tale. And the prologue explains how the harm came to be, how we got to have this problem. And he calls this portion of the fairy tale that explains the problem and how we got to the problem, he calls this the preparatory part. So this is Propp's preparatory part. And now we're getting into the alphabet soup here. Okay, so he says the first one is technically not a function, but we could treat it like it's a function. Alpha, he uses Greek letters for all of these to distinguish them from the letters of the alphabet that he's going to use later on. So alpha is the initial situation. This is like, you know, once upon a time there was an ogre who lived in a swamp. That's the initial situation. That's basically all you need. And usually these fairy tales say there was an initial situation and then something came along to change that. For the Raven Girl, once upon a time there was a queen with a baby. And then something was going to cause that to change. Okay, so beta is what Propp calls, his Greek letter for what he calls absentation. Someone is isolated in some way. The hero is either isolated from family or family members have gone away from the hero. In Disney movies, this is, you know, the hero's parents or the hero's mother is dead, or heroine's mother is dead. There's a lot of dead mothers. And fairy tales really frequently seem to have this isolating situation where the character is isolated in some way. So that's Propp's idea of absentation. For Shrek, it would be pretty simple that he is isolated from society because he's an ogre. That's pretty much all you need for this. So if we were analyzing Shrek, we would put down beta. Shrek is isolated. Okay, gamma is for what Propp calls an interdiction. We've seen these before. These are commandments to not do something. Don't leave the path, in the example of Little Red Riding Hood. I don't think we have a clear example of this for Shrek. I don't think we do anyway. He's not told not to do something. But we have examples in Little Red Riding Hood. Little Red Riding Hood is told not to leave the path. And we have in the story of the Goose Girl, don't lose your magic 3 drops of blood handkerchief, things like that. And of course, that's always going to be failed, disobeyed, because it's part of the way these stories work. So he gives the failure of the interdiction, the disobedience of the commandment, he gives that the letter delta, in the Greek letter delta. Yeah, what's kind of interesting is that these interdictions can also happen later in the story, is something we've noticed with these fairy tales. Like the guy who's told, don't fall asleep, don't drink the wine and eat the food, and he fails. So there's a gamma and a delta from the middle of the story. So these aren't always in the prologue, but prologues seem to have these interdictions most often. Okay, epsilon is Propp's letter for reconnaissance. So reconnaissance, the villain is trying to figure out the whereabouts of the hero or try and find more information on the hero. The villain goes on a spying mission. Not really something we see in Shrek. We see it in Snow White, where the Wicked Queen says, who's the fairest one of all? And she finds out about Snow White. And then later she does it again, and she finds out Snow White is still alive. So this is epsilon and zeta. This is 2 functions, according to Propp, asking the question and finding out the information. Eta is trickery. The villain tries to trick a victim to steal from or kidnap them. It tries to kidnap a family member or someone in general. The villain just does something tricky. And then theta is when the villain falls for the trick. In the story of the Goose Girl, this would be when the villain, the evil servant, tricks the king and the prince, and the king and the prince fall for the trick, and this leads to the problem that that the hero has, the Goose Girl has. So that's part of why I like to think that the Goose Girl is the hero. And so this leads to harm for the hero. Now, all of these, like I said, except maybe the initial situation sort of thing, these are generally optional. You don't have to have all of these. You usually have some of these. And like I said, there's a little looseness with putting them in other parts of the story. But Vladimir ran out of letters. So, you know, he put them all in the preparatory part of the story. Okay, but then we finally get back to our harm or a lack. The reason it's important to identify our harm or our lack first is because that's kind of core to the whole problem the hero's trying to solve and what the hero's trying to do. Okay, now we can get into our letters of the alphabet more properly. So we had letter A for our harm or our lack. And again, a lot of these are optional, and even though Propp has like an order that he wants to go in, the truth of the matter is they don't always have to go in exact alphabetical order. They can move around a lot, and they're not all going to be present. But letter B for Propp would be a dispatcher sends the hero away from home, sends the hero on a quest. We definitely have that in Shrek. Shrek shows up at the tournament. Lord Farquaad sends him on a journey to go rescue Fiona. So that would be letter B. And it's pretty simple. Counteraction is when the hero decides to take action, decides to solve the problem that they have. So that would be Shrek saying, "What kind of quest?" And trying to go off and, you know, solve the problem. Or alternatively, it's when he's in his swamp and yells about the fairy tale creatures. He's like, "I'm going to Farquaad and getting rid of you." That's when Shrek does his counteraction. So there's some ways in which this is open to interpretation. Okay, DEF is what's known as the donor sequence. And you might notice I'm not going to do every letter of the alphabet here, but we can get into that a little bit more. DEF is when the donor appears, the donor tests the hero, and the donor gives the hero a magical thing. If we want to think of Donkey as a donor who maybe gives like Shrek advice or something like that, we definitely have Donkey testing Shrek, which is a trait that's also associated with helpers as well. This idea of testing, but for Propp, testing is letter E, because then you can go DEF with donors. And so Donkey definitely tests Shrek, letter E, and then gives Shrek help, whether you want to say that's as a helper or as a donor of magical, wise advice or something like that. But we could arguably have that along the way. Okay, now, so what I'm doing here basically is we can get into the details of all 31 of Propp's functions, but what I wanted to do is focus on the ones I think are most important in the story. So this is why I have the major Propp functions here. And I actually have a handout, which we can look at in a second, of all the Propp functions. And I will put that in the content page for today's videos and today's discussions. I wanted to focus just on what I think are the most important ones, the ones that seem to have the greatest emphasis. And these would be the ones I want you guys to remember the most. Now, ideally, you'll be able to use the handout to look at the story and say, oh yeah, okay, this function is going on here. But you don't have to have all of them memorized. I would say if you want to know the letters of any of them, these would be the ones to know. Okay, so K is for when the hero solves their original problem. And what's interesting about fairy tales is that so often the hero tends to solve their original problem separately from solving a different problem along the way. So, for instance, I think Shrek is actually a really good example of this. That Shrek actually solves the problem of having all these fairy tale creatures in his swamp. He manages to get rid of them, but he's realized that he actually is trying to solve another problem, which is, you know, his loneliness. So K is the end of like that part of the story. And it is the end for Shrek, but he realizes that he's lonely and he actually is in love with Fiona and wants to be with her. So his story becomes much more about rescuing Fiona from Farquaad from that point on. And then so K is very important in that sense. Then you have M and N. I mentioned difficult tasks are a big thing in this story. Propp reserves these letters for when it's a difficult task given by the princess. So this could be, as Donkey puts it, going into a castle guarded by a fire-breathing dragon, walking a rickety bridge over a boiling lake of lava. Those would be Fiona's tasks for Shrek. And then other tasks would be, the things that she asks of him along the way on their journey, getting to know him. Those could also be thought of as Shrek's tasks that he has to fulfill to rescue Fiona. But the hero generally achieves these difficult tasks. We saw in the story of the Raven that this was all about these difficult tasks, and the hero continuously failing at these difficult tasks. But in the end, he finally succeeds by alternate means. R is a big one. The hero returns home. Shrek does this. A lot of other characters do this, but it's an optional step. Sometimes the hero returns home because the hero is being chased. And so Propp gives the letter PR to pursuing the hero. The villain is in hot pursuit, chasing the hero all the way home, and the hero has to escape. Sometimes the hero is rescued. Arguably, a donkey might serve that purpose of rescue in certain ways. Yeah, now you'll notice here that Propp stopped using just straight up letters and started putting in additional letters, which I think is very unfair and very cheating and kind of destroys his whole theme here, but what can you do? So he's cheating at the alphabet here, but whatever, we'll just accept it. This is his method. And U, of course, is for the villain being punished. So we stopped the pretense of these having to be related to the actual words here. So U is for the punishment of the villain. And Propp picked letter U because it comes at nearly the very end. It's quite often the second to last thing that happens in the story. In Shrek, we have Lord Farquaad get eaten by a dragon. It's very satisfying. So yeah, that's a classic example. Pretty much every fairy tale I can think of that has a villain, and most of them do, end with the villain being punished in some way. Disney movies like to have, even when they're not explicitly based on fairy tales, they like to have the villain be punished in some way, but they always do it off screen, so it's not so gruesome. With the Brothers Grimm, you get the birds pecking out people's eyes and stuff like that. Yeah, so villain being punished, classic stuff. And then finally, the end of one of these stories is usually the wedding. And so here we have the letter actually work again, W for wedding. And Propp says that almost always these stories end in the hero marrying a princess, or with some female heroes, the heroine marrying the prince. Cinderella gets her prince, right? So the hero got what they thought they wanted. That was letter K, but they actually get something bigger, which is the wedding. And so you can kind of take a story and say, okay, this story was about, in theory, ending the fairy tale creatures being in his swamp, but was actually about falling in love with Fiona. So I think Shrek is a really great example of this sort of a change here, this sort of transition from one concept to another. Now, sometimes it's much less of a romantic comedy than that. Sometimes it's much more like, the princess is just a prop. She's just a reward at the end of the story, and she doesn't really have her own agency or identity. This is our happily ever after, effectively. And so Propp says sometimes you can have some other kind of reward instead of marrying the princess. Maybe you just get made king. Maybe you just get a bunch of money. So there can be other types of rewards. It doesn't have to be all princess marrying, all weddings all the time. But how does Shrek end? It ends with the wedding, of course. It's very satisfying and it feels very fairy tale-y. So I think Shrek kind of stumbled on some brilliance in terms of it's a parody of fairy tales, but it's actually a really good fairy tale. Okay, so those are our major functions. Hopefully it's not too overwhelming here. I would say try to know the letters for at least these ones. The rest of them, don't worry about knowing the letters so much. So what Propp's methodology allows us to do is, if we go back to the Word document here, we can make a list of the functions that are involved in this story. So going back to the preparatory part to make sure that we've got them all. So we've got alpha, we've got an initial situation, we've got beta, Shrek is isolated. We don't have gamma, delta. I don't think we really have epsilon or zeta. Maybe it's arguable. Then we've got letter A, the initial situation. Just what are you doing in my swamp? You've got Lord Farquaad acting as a dispatcher. You've got Shrek doing a counteraction, which is deciding to solve the problem. Then you've got, I didn't mention this here, but very often Propp will draw an upward arrow when the hero leaves home, because in almost all of these stories, the hero leaves home, and he'll draw a downward arrow when the hero comes back. Let's say that Donkey is not a donor, but he's a helper. So he performs the testing, which is letter E, but he doesn't perform the giving of a gift per se, unless you want to count the dragon. But he does some things that are helpful for Shrek along the way. Shrek solves his original problem by rescuing Fiona, but he is ultimately unhappy with that. Letter M and N, he definitely has that a couple of times over. He has to solve some difficult tasks along the way to rescue Fiona. He returns. Now, I don't know why Propp has the return of the hero and he has the downward arrow, which I'm going to make that a letter V here, but it's not the letter V, it's a downward arrow. Don't know why Propp has both a return and a downward arrow. They had to guess, maybe it's something about the hero coming home, but nobody recognizes him. We would probably have letter L in there somewhere, which is Lord Farquaad pretending to be a hero. So L is for false heroes making grandiose claims and failing. Then I don't know if we have an example. Lord Farquaad doesn't really chase Shrek. But you could say that Shrek kind of needs to be rescued by Donkey. So let's put rescue on there. Donkey helps him by rescuing him from his own depression, basically. And Shrek goes to the wedding, and Lord Farquaad is punished. And of course, it all ends in a real wedding for Shrek and Fiona. So that would be if Vladimir Propp was making a roadmap to Shrek, he would make this list right here. So he's basically saying, this is what's important about this story, is that there's all these functions going on within it. And these are the tools that are used to tell the story. And this is what makes this story different from any other story, is that it has these specific events, these specific characters, and these specific tools. Now, that's the question here is, how much is Propp really able to talk about content? He isn't able to talk about the fact that Shrek is a parody. He isn't really able to talk about the themes of like loneliness versus ugliness, loneliness and ugliness versus, having people accept you for who you are. So he isn't really able to talk about any of that. He's just able to talk about the structure. I do think there's some insight here, but there's also inherently some limitations. So yes, if we look back at the dramatis personae here, we can see that specific functions are more associated with specific characters. The dispatcher, of course, always dispatches. The donor is associated with DEF, and then the gift usually helps them do a difficult task. The hero is very strongly associated with ABC because the hero is trying to solve a problem. The hero usually achieves some kind of victory over their original problem, but then has a greater victory because of the wedding. The villain harms the hero but is punished. The helper can do things like transport the hero. We could add that here for Donkey, that Donkey transports Shrek. Helps him do his difficult tasks. He rescues him. He helps Shrek solve his original problem, which is having people in his swamp. The princess is, of course, Fiona, and she gives Shrek a lot of tasks, but is eventually married. And the false hero does some of the things that the hero does, but ultimately fails and acts like a false version of the hero, which is Lord Farquaad. Yeah. So I think this has been a lot for one video. I'm going to talk a little bit more about some more of Propp's terminology, and then we'll look at a few more examples in the next video.